Evelyn Zumaya reads AffairsValentino.
I am Evelyn Zumaya, the author of AffairsValentino, and I want to read my book to you from page 324, chapter 16, titled Lost in the Woods. New York City, August 1926. During the summer of 1926, Egyptian fakir Rahman Bey was getting under magician Harry Houdini's skin. This was not due to the fact that Fakir Bey's popular stage act included such feats as snoozing on the business edge of a steel sword, being buried alive in a coffin, and threading foot-long steel needles through his skin. Houdini was miffed because each of Bey's performances concluded with a public taunting as he mouthed the word Houdini. Bey accomplished his wizardry while exhibiting not a twinge of pain and without shedding a single drop of his fakir blood. He claimed he was able to do the impossible because of his ability to slip into a cataleptic trance and slow his heart and breathing to a near-death rate. Harry Houdini denounced Bey's claims as pure bunk and began staging his own rebuttal performances to prove he was a fraud. Rahman Bey and Houdini took each other's bait, and the rivalry was on. During the heated competition, Fakir Bey acquired a devoted following, and by August he was a popular performer in several Manhattan speakeasies, including the 300 Club on 54th Street. Discreetly billed as the, quote, the world's most famous rendezvous of stage, screen, society, and finance, the 300 Club was owned and operated by Mary Louise Cecilia Guinan, a.k.a. Tex Guinan, from Waco, Texas. Knowing Fakir Rahman Bey to be a guaranteed showstopper, Tex Guinan hired him to amaze her famous clientele. On one evening, Tex Guinan told her 40 fan dancers to give their ostrich feathers a rest, and motioned for Fakir Bey to take the floor. Seated in Bey's audience in that jam-packed, smoky room were Rudolph Valentino and George Ullman. Along with everyone else in the crowd, they were throwing back way too many drinks, and by the time Tex wedged her way over to their table with Fakir Bey, they were lit. Tex gave a holler to her patrons to pipe down, because the fakir was about to astound them all. With Rudy's help, he did. While Rudy and George stared in amazement, Bey slipped a steel needle into his cheek and out through his mouth. As he held the needle high and took his bow, the audience applauded and shouted for an encore. It was then Tex Guinan challenged the fakir to perform the same trick on Rudy. With the patrons of the 300 Club shouting in approval, Rudy nodded that he was game. George's resounding voice of dissent was barely audible over the din. He was not so inebriated that he failed to recognize the real threat to Rudy's most valuable asset and yelled across the table at Rudy, "If Fakir Bey is piercing anything, for God's sake, make it your arm." Rudy savored the moment and lit another cigarette. To the crowd's whoops and whistles he stood, removed his jacket, and rolled up one sleeve. So the sheik's forearm came to be pierced clean through with a steel needle wielded by a man in sheik's clothing. Amazingly, the trick worked like a charm, and Rudy felt nothing, did not bleed, and laughed the performance off by shaking Bey's hand. George missed the entire demonstration as he was searching for rubbing alcohol in order to disinfect the 2 small puncture wounds on Rudy's arm. Before Rudy could roll down his sleeve, George was slopping his forearm with the alcohol and grateful it hadn't been his face. Fakir Bey offered no explanation to his cheering audience as to how his cataleptic trance prevented Rudy's arm from bleeding. And fortunately, this was one trick Harry Houdini passed on replicating. Rudy and George arrived in New York City that July to attend the East Coast premieres of The Son of the Sheik. After seeing his brother Alberto and family off on their return journey to Italy, Rudy resumed his dolce vita, often with Ziegfeld Folly Marion Benda along for the ride. Whether it was Marion Benda or whomever else he chose as his escort for the night, The opportunity to share in Rudy's limelight was jealously guarded. The press was hot on his high profile, and New Yorkers eagerly read coverage of his nightly appearances around town. As a result of this unrelenting publicity, lines outside theaters showing The Son of the Sheik were long, and box office takes nothing short of titanic. While Joe Shanks savored the revenue for United Artists, George Ullman was the busiest man in Manhattan. With Rudy commanding such intense media attention, even the news clipping bureaus George retained to track the publicity struggled to stay abreast of the press. With all of his personal and business affairs being handled by George, Rudy had ample time to instigate even more uproar. He accepted more invitations to the theater, sporting events, and private parties than he could possibly attend, and hosted his own A-list dinner parties. He even met with Paramount Pictures' Adolph Zukor in an apparent effort to make amends, and granted an interview to writer and journalist H.L. Mencken. With George tracking invoices and remitting payments for this imperial Manhattan lifestyle, Rudy continued to sign on the bottom line, and no one disputed he was a guaranteed high time that summer. But whether Beauty Marion Benda was aware of it or not, she had competition for his company. Gossip columnists buzzed that eligible bachelor Rudy was seen with several different women on his arm. One late night he was spotted dining with his first ex-wife Jean Acker. According to the report, Jean Acker was on her way to Europe with her mother, but decided to spend a few days in New York to make amends with her ex. In between Rudy's social spinning, he and George met their obligations with United Artists by attending the East Coast openings of The Son of the Sheik. By the time they made a quick trip back to Chicago for the movie's premiere at the Roosevelt Theater, Rudy had yet to receive a response from the author of the Pink Powder Puff editorial. The Chicago press seized upon the publicity opportunity of the unrequited challenge, and Rudy obliged by lacing on a pair of boxing gloves and staging another exhibition sparring match in a local gym. He then proclaimed victory over his unidentified opponent by publishing his statement of final defiance. The piece appeared in every newspaper in Chicago except the Chicago Tribune and read in part, quote, "It is evident you cannot make a coward fight any more than you can draw blood out of a turnip. The heroic silence of the writer who chose to attack me without any provocation in the Chicago Tribune leaves no doubt as to the total absence of manliness in his whole makeup. I feel I have been vindicated because I consider his silence as a tacit retraction and an admission which I am forced to accept, even though it is not entirely to my liking." End quote. After The Son of the Sheik showing at the Roosevelt Theater, Rudy walked on stage to a thunderous ovation and delivered a heartfelt speech to the standing room-only crowd. He praised his friend Agnes Ayres for her commitment to perform in The Son of the Sheik after she had just given birth to her first child. Opening night in Chicago went smoothly, but this would not be the case when the film debuted in New York. There, the streets around the Mark Strand Theater became so congested with crowds straining for a glimpse of Rudy that George requested a police motorcycle escort for his safe arrival. But fans arrived early, and as Rudy and George's limousine pulled up to the theater, every entrance was blocked. When the police failed to clear a path from the limousine to the theater door, George took matters into his own hands. He threw his suit jacket over Rudy's head, and with the forward rush of a football linebacker, he cut his way through the mob. Despite George's body guarding, every button and both cuffs were torn from Rudy's shirt, the pockets ripped from his suit coat, and hair yanked from his head. His return sprint to the limousine after the film's opening was an even more perilous mission. When Rudy and George did reach the safety of the limousine, fans clawed through the car's open windows and surrounded the vehicle, making it impossible to move the car in any direction. In the thick of this melee, someone in the crowd was struck by the limousine. Rudy, George, and the driver heard the awful thud, but could see no one who appeared to have been hurt or injured. Knowing Rudy would be mauled if the car doors were opened, George waved the driver to move on. In the Ambassador Hotel suite, Rudy fretted over his missing tufts of hair and peeled off one more ruined suit, while George put a call through to the police. He inquired if anyone had just reported an accident outside the Mark Strand. The police said no, and the subject was closed. Rudy's final Son of the Sheik appearance was scheduled for August 16th in Philadelphia. He would then head home to Los Angeles with George and Bea to begin filming the first movie under his new contract with United Artists, The Firebrand. During the week prior to this appearance in Philadelphia, George scheduled a radio interview for Rudy to be broadcast from the Steel Pier on the Atlantic City Boardwalk in New Jersey. On the drive to Atlantic City, Rudy took the wheel of the car and reached his usual breakneck speed. George was all too familiar with Rudy's lead foot, but that day he was less concerned over his rough ride to the Jersey shore than he was with Rudy's haggard appearance. It was obvious the sweltering August heat was only aggravating Rudy's condition, and his past week of late-night revelry and imbibing in quantities of bootleg whiskey was taking a severe toll. The crowds swarming along the boardwalk that afternoon proved to be unusually stressful for both Rudy and George. During Rudy's radio interview, hordes of his fans pressed against the radio station's windows with such force that George kept a nervous eye on the plate glass as he watched it bow under the pressure. Exhausted from the afternoon's efforts, George hoped he and Rudy would return to Manhattan immediately after the broadcast for some sorely needed rest. Instead, Rudy gulped down a tall glass of bicarbonate of soda and water and informed his weary manager that he wanted to stay in Atlantic City that evening to attend a performance of Gus Edwards' All-Star Review. Against his better judgment, George telephoned the nightclub where the show was headlining to make the usual arrangements for Rudy's safety, entry through a side door, and seating at a private table obscured from public view. Gus Edwards was a showman well known for dragging anyone, especially a celebrity, on stage to be a part of his show. And as soon as he spotted Rudy and George, he made a show-stopping announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, the Sheik will now dance a tango." Rudy emerged from the shadows to the chants of "Rudy, Rudy, Rudy," and stepped reluctantly into the full glare of the spotlight. He sauntered onto the dance floor, leaving a trail of swooning women in his path, and there selected the most ravishing stage dancer in the show to be his dance partner. Unaware of his deteriorating physical condition, the audience roared in approval as Rudy swept the chorus girl into a brief but dramatically executed tango. When news of his performance reached nearby strollers on the boardwalk, crowds rushed to the nightclub's entrances and pressed in closer for a glimpse of the show. The club's kitchen staff craned their necks over their hot grills, and waiters stopped in their tracks. By the time Rudy took his few perfunctory bows, he was sweating profusely, and as he attempted a return to his table, he faced an impasse of grasping fans. George wasted no time, and within a few minutes he was muscling his way through the sea of flailing arms and safety, escorting Rudy away from the melee and out the nearest exit. Gus Edwards' audience that night was unaware they had just enjoyed an historic floor show. They may not have seen Rudy's most polished tango performance, but they were all witness to his final one. It was only a few days later, while he visited his friend columnist Adela Rogers St. John, that she discovered Rudy rummaging through her medicine cabinet in search of some bicarbonate of soda. He complained of acute indigestion and attributed his malaise to having eaten too many snails the night before. Adela St. John thought differently, as she was of the opinion that Rudy was ailing because he missed his ex-wife, Natasha. She wondered if his divorce might have been the inspiration for his increasingly liquid diet of whiskey. Rudy boasted to her and his other friends that he was following his whiskey regime to shed a few pounds, and claimed he could go days without eating a bite. Whether the source of his indigestion was his divorce from Natasha or the effects of too much questionable bootleg whiskey, Rudy was hardly pining for anyone. Natasha had recently returned to her parents' chateau on the French Riviera, and Rudy's girlfriend Paula Negri was a neat 3,000 miles away in Hollywood. Bottom line was, he was being faithful to no one. George knew this to be the case, especially concerning Pola Negri. He shared the ambassador suite with Rudy and overheard his many heated phone calls with Pola. On what would be their last conversation, George caught the end of the spat as Rudy bellowed into the phone, "Well, you can go to hell." With those words, he slammed down the receiver and turned to George. "Well, she can go out with her so-called prince if she wants to, but not with me." Rudy's late hours and exhausting social schedule were taxing even George's stamina. Some mornings he woke when he heard Rudy enter the hotel suite, but more often he slept soundly through his arrivals. When George didn't stir, he was often roused from his sleep by a tap on the shoulder. Rudy, still in his evening clothes, would be standing over him. It was early on the morning of August 14th when George opened one eye to again see Rudy standing by the bed. On this occasion, he was holding a glass of iced mineral water. "George," Rudy nudged, "would you like some water?" "Why the CPR service?" George rubbed his face in an attempt to rally. "Oh, I thought you might be thirsty." Rudy handed him the ice water. "You mean," George said as he sat up in bed and took a drink, "that you were bringing me this peace offering, hoping that I will not scold you for getting home at 5 o'clock in the morning." "Well," Rudy made his point, "actually I intended to ask you to see that I'm not disturbed until noon." Late that afternoon, Rudy showered, shaved, and dressed for yet another round of parties and guest appearances. His date for the evening would again be Marion Benda. They shared a late dinner at Lido's restaurant and then stopped by Tex Guinan's before cabbing back to Marion's place just after midnight. After a 2-hour tryst in her apartment, elevator operator Frank Gross ferried Rudy and Marion down to the lobby and noticed it was around 3 a.m. when he witnessed Rudy hailing a cab. The driver of that taxi cab, Mike Licalzi, then drove the couple to East 80th Street and Park Avenue, the apartment of playboy Barclay Warburton. Upon arriving at the address, Rudy left Marion waiting in the cab while he rang the doorbell of the prestigious residence. When no one answered, he yelled up towards the apartment windows and whistled through his teeth a few times in an attempt to rouse Warburton's attention. Receiving no response, Rudy decided to head around the corner where he entered the building through a side door. Before long, he reappeared from the building's main entrance, paid cabby Licalzi $1 for the 60-cent fare, and escorted Marion up to Warburton's apartment. That Saturday night, Barclay Warburton was entertaining a few of his friends in celebration of the news that his Parisian divorce was declared final that day. According to Marion's account, Rudy downed many drinks at the wee hours gathering, ate a ham and egg sandwich, and complained he felt rotten. The party at Warburton's continued until dawn, and by the time Rudy dragged himself home to the Ambassador Hotel, he was in the throes of what he believed to be just another bout of indigestion. When he walked into the suite that Sunday morning, George and Bea were eating their breakfast in the sitting room. George looked up, quickly assessed Rudy's appearance, and told him he looked like hell. Rudy replied he would join them for breakfast in a few minutes and then disappeared into his bedroom. He was in his room only a minute before George and Bea heard him curse loudly and groan. George was up from the breakfast table and through the door of Rudy's bedroom. He found him sitting on the edge of his bed holding a tall glass tumbler. George said he was calling the hotel desk requesting they summon a doctor, but Rudy waved him off, saying, "No, George, I'll be fine." He then began filling the empty glass with straight bourbon from a flask on his night table, saying he didn't want to be disturbed until late that afternoon because he had a big date that night. In one long gulp, Rudy swallowed the entire glass of bourbon, then stretched out on the bed and said to George, "See, I feel better already." Since this scene had been repeated for days, George shook his head and returned to his breakfast. On their way out for the day, George and Bea stopped by the hotel's front desk with a request that all calls to Mr. Valentino's suite be held until their return. About 4 o'clock that afternoon, the Ullmans returned to the Ambassador Hotel, and immediately upon entering the suite, they heard a loud groaning emanating from Rudy's bedroom. George was through the bedroom door for the second time that day and found Rudy doubled up on his bed, clutching his stomach. Before Rudy could say a word, George grabbed the telephone and called the hotel desk, demanding a doctor be sent up to the suite as fast as possible. The desk clerk knew that a Dr. Paul Durham lived nearby and placed the call. Within 5 minutes, Dr. Durham was making a quick assessment of Rudy's condition. He diagnosed Rudy's severe abdominal pain as a perforated ulcer and suggested he be transported to a hospital at once. Rudy balked at the idea and maintained more whiskey would bring him around. Dr. Durham and George denied this request and instead placed a telephone call to another nearby physician, Dr. Manning. Dr. Manning arrived within a few minutes, and after he confirmed Dr. Durham's diagnosis, George called for an ambulance. At 5:15 that Sunday afternoon, Rudy walked from the ambulance into the Polyclinic Hospital's emergency room. Despite his excruciating pain, he refused to be carried in on a stretcher. Upon his admittance, he was examined by Dr. William Rawls, the hospital's chief resident surgeon. When Rudy explained to the physician he'd been suffering from his symptoms for nearly 10 hours, Dr. Rawls feared the worst. Rudolph Valentino was probably a dead man. Dr. Rawls and his attending surgeon, Dr. Howard Meeker, both knew that anyone experiencing Rudy's exact symptoms for more than 8 hours had little chance of ever recovering. They found Rudy was running a high fever, and his pulse was racing. More alarming, they discovered his abdominal muscles were manifesting a board-like rigidity, all symptoms of advancing peritonitis. In the days before antibiotics, this type of aggressive infection was seldom reversed after reaching this stage. Knowing time to be of the essence, Dr. Meeker instructed the attending nurse to prepare his patient for surgery. While Rudy was wheeled away on a gurney, word was spreading on the street that the sheik had just been admitted to the hospital. Reporters descended upon the polyclinic's front desk, and so many curious people were filtering into the hospital's lobby that a nearby office space was designated as a press room. Recognizing the obvious urgency to protect Rudy's privacy, George asked Dr. Durham to assist him in the selection of 2 trustworthy nurses and 2 security guards. One of these guards would be stationed outside the door of Rudy's room, and the other would patrol the hospital corridor. It was sometime around 6 o'clock, only 45 minutes after Drs. Rawls and Meeker made their initial examination, when Rudy was placed on the operating table. While George chain-smoked and paced a fast groove in the carpet of a nearby waiting room, the ether mask was lowered over Rudy's face, and Dr. Meeker reached for his scalpel. Instead of making his rounds as the toast of Manhattan that Sunday evening, the son of the sheik checked his Savile Row suit for a mantle of crisp hospital linens. The face that had women all over the world dizzy with love was inhaling ether through a black rubber mask, and the muscular body which Rudy proudly flexed for his swooning public over the past few weeks was being swabbed with iodine. When Dr. Meeker determined his patient to be under the effects of the anesthesia, he made his first incision, a vertical slice through the right rectus muscle. What Dr. Meeker and the attending physician then discovered defied even their grimmest expectations. The body cavity of the apparently robust 31-year-old was ravaged. Rudy's entire intestinal tract was coated in a greenish-gray mucus, and a lesion 1 centimeter in diameter gaped on the anterior wall of his stomach. Dr. Meeker would later notate the precise location of this profound ulcer as being 3 centimeters from the pylorus valve and 2 centimeters from the lesser curvature of the stomach. With no natural walling off of the stomach fluid and food particles, Rudy's intestinal tract was thick with debris. While the surgical nurse began suctioning this fluid, Dr. Meeker excised the area of tissue immediately surrounding the ulcer. The surgeon could see that this ulcer had not developed overnight, but had obviously been festering for some time. He came to this conclusion after discovering an area of about 1 1/2 centimeters around the opening of the ulcer that was already in the advanced stages of gangrene. Meeker cut away the necrotic, gangrenous tissue and began stitching with mattress sutures to prepare the hole in Rudy's stomach. As he threaded the fine linen sutures through the wound, he stitched a rubber drainage tube into Rudy's side. The surgical nurse continued her suctioning while flushing the entire body cavity with a saline wash to ensure the drainage tube was properly positioned. Meeker then made his decision to remove Rudy's appendix. As a surgeon, he realized any further surgery at that juncture might jeopardize Rudy's recovery, but he had no other option. The appendix was so inflamed as a result of the acute abdominal infection that it was constricting a portion of Rudy's intestinal tract called the terminal ileum. Meeker snipped away at the appendix and implanted a second drainage tube in the right iliac fossa pelvic area. He then began his final suturing of the abdominal wound. During the operation, Rudy came close to death when he slipped into profound shock. His pulse rate soared to 140, and his fever reached 104.5 degrees. With his heart racing and still under the effects of the ether, he was wheeled back to his heavily guarded room on the polyclinic's 8th floor. Dr. Meeker entered the waiting room to give George his report. After hearing the medical details of Rudy's operation, George asked the surgeon exactly what were Rudy's chances of survival. Meeker's 2-ton words leveled him. 50-50. George was speechless and immediately left Dr. Meeker to see Rudy. He found him already in his room, still unconscious and suspended in leather shoulder harnesses on a bed slanted in a vertical position to facilitate proper drainage from his wound. George stumbled forward, staring in shock at the sight of Rudy hanging on his iron crucifix of a bed. He knew he had only a little time before Rudy woke from the effects of the ether, and he turned his attention to the pressing details of Rudy's stay in the hospital. He barred any visitors from the sick room except himself and Frank Mennillo, and forbid any medical staff from relaying a word to Rudy about the true gravity of his illness. He also warned the 2 nurses on duty, Pearl Frank and Jean Littlefield, that they were not to allow a single newspaper in the room. Knowing more reporters were gathering in the hospital's press room, George then walked down to the hospital's 1st floor to hand them the blow-by-blow developments. By the time George returned from the press conference, Rudy was regaining consciousness. When he saw George enter the room, he asked in a frail but resolute voice, "Well, George, did I behave like a pink powder puff or like a man?" New Yorkers awoke that Monday morning to the sound of newsboys screaming the bad news about Rudolph Valentino's surgery. While the world read of Rudy's medical plight, he woke that Monday morning on the 8th floor of the Polyclinic Hospital, strapped to his vertical bed, with a nurse flushing his body with saline injections. With his fever spiking, he told George that he just felt so tired. All day Monday and Tuesday, Rudy slept fitfully in his upright position, and there was little change in his condition. By Wednesday morning, the drainage from his abdomen ceased, and his temperature dropped to nearly normal. But despite his feeling better and being allowed to sip a cup of broth, Rudy was reaching his limit with the shoulder harnesses. He demanded George light a cigarette for him and barked at his nurses to allow him to sit upright. His ill temper was a relief to George and a sure sign of recovery. But Rudy's doctors were not as encouraged and continued to meet in closed-door conferences. They knew that the next 24 hours would be critical and monitored Rudy for any signs of post-surgical infection. On Wednesday, Rudy's temperature was almost normal and his pulse rate slowing, as he and George discussed a few possible locations for what promised to be a lengthy recovery. But on the streets below the 8th floor hospital room and George and Rudy's encouraging bedside conversations, there were rumblings, and Rudy's sudden illness came under suspicion. Many people believed someone might have tried to kill Rudolph Valentino. His fans perceived him as a veritable man of muscle, an indomitable action hero, and were adamant he'd been in perfect health. The news he fell gravely ill so quickly was not easily accepted, and along Broadway, rumors ran rampant that he might have been poisoned at Barclay Warburton's late-night party the previous Sunday. By Wednesday, the rumors of Rudy's possible poisoning, perhaps even by arsenic, were making national headlines. This situation prompted New York Assistant District Attorney Pecora to telephone George and assure him he would open an investigation if any credible evidence was brought to his attention. But Rudy's doctors and George knew Rudy's illness was no mystery. His condition had not manifested unexpectedly at any one party, but had been developing over a period of many weeks. For George, the troublesome poisoning rumors became just more disturbing information to keep from Rudy. The rumors of foul play and arsenic poisoning caused Joe Schenck to be concerned about their possible negative impact on his hefty son of the sheik revenues. He was in New York at the time and issued his own statement to the press, in which he requested that out of respect for Rudy, the unsettling insinuations must cease at once. Everyone from George to Doctors Meeker and Rawls to Barclay Warburton, Marion Benda, and even Rudy's nurse Pearl Frank, who was accosted by reporters in her home, all swore there was no evidence to support the poisoning theory. By Thursday, crowds milled in the streets below Rudy's hospital room, and a few permanent vigils claimed strategic locations directly under his window. Through George, Rudy issued a message of gratitude to his fans and well-wishers who showered him with so many floral arrangements the surplus had to be donated to the hospital's free wards. He graciously thanked them for their kind letters, their thoughtful gifts, and their hundreds of religious medals. As the diehards tended to their camps below Rudy's window, they hung on every detail of his progress as issued by his doctors and George. Recognizing the public's intense interest in Rudy's hospitalization, newspapers devoted pages of copy to the movie star's childhood in southern Italy, to his struggle to become a success in the motion picture industry, to his marital woes, and to in-depth analysis of his revolutionary lovemaking techniques. By midweek, Rudy's illness and recovery had taken on an air of riveting suspense, rivaling any of his movies. It seemed the world was waiting on bated breath for the sheik to rise from his hospital bed, dash to his own nick-of-time rescue, and ride along another ridge of some distant sand dune towards another thrilling ending. By Thursday afternoon, it appeared this just might happen. Rudy took care of a little business and asked George to dispatch wires to Natasha and Alberto. He was able to sit up in his bed for a while and listen as George read some of the hundreds of telegrams from his fans and his friends in Hollywood. He chipperly told Dr. Meeker that he looked forward to taking him on a fishing trip after his full recovery. Despite Rudy's upbeat mood, George still eyed his doctor's concern and wondered why their long faces. On Friday, George placed his regular morning phone call to Lou Mahoney at Falcon Lair and spoke with Frank Mennillo to give him an update on Rudy's condition. Frank visited Rudy every day during the previous week, and that Friday he informed George of his plans to leave for Toms River on the Jersey Shore the following Monday to vacation with his son Arnold. He told George that he'd put those plans on hold if Rudy did not continue to improve over the weekend. George assured Frank that Rudy felt well enough that afternoon to ask him for a hand mirror. He went on to relate how he'd hesitated because the fact was Rudy looked horrible. His face was ashen, his cheeks hollow, and his eyes blood red. But George explained to Frank that he'd handed him the mirror anyway because Rudy wanted to see what he looked like in case he ever played the part of an ailing character. By studying the effects of his illness on his face, he said he would know exactly what to do with his makeup. That Friday afternoon, just as George was dispatching another round of encouraging telegrams, Rudy's fever began an ominous climb. When he complained of a sharp pain in his upper left chest and side, George summoned Dr. Meeker. Meeker made the examination and diagnosed pleurisy in Rudy's left lung, an inflammation of the membrane surrounding the lung and symptomatic of the onset of pneumonia. George felt the immediate impact when Dr. Meeker said the word pneumonia. He knew Rudy had been smoking 100 cigarettes a day and feared his lungs would be in no condition to survive the dreaded disease. During this examination, Dr. Meeker also listened to Rudy's heart and quickly summoned a consultant to verify his next diagnosis. The valves of Rudy's heart were malfunctioning. Both the heart failure and pneumonia were evidence of an aggressive infection spreading through the abdominal cavity. Meeker ordered Rudy back into the shoulder harnesses, his bed elevated once again, and the regular saline injections resumed. He scrawled his diagnosis of septic endocarditis on Rudy's chart hanging on the end of his bed. To any physician of the day, this meant imminent death. The inflammation in Rudy's left lung caused his every breath to be excruciatingly painful. With his fever again rising past 103 degrees, his doctors ordered injections of morphine around the clock. Unfortunately for Rudy, this merciful drug not only rendered him pain-free and unconscious for a few hours, but also flatlined any lingering ounce of strength he might have had to fight the advancing infection. Despite the morphine being administered every 3 hours, much of the time Rudy writhed in agony. His acute suffering caused George to panic, and he convened another conference with the medical team. On Saturday, he and the physicians brainstormed 2 last resorts for Rudy: blood transfusions and the possible use of Metafen. Metafen was a mercury-based antiseptic not widely available at the time, and its intravenous applications were still considered to be in the experimental stages. The fact that the only laboratory producing Metafen was located in Detroit, Michigan, made this treatment even more of a long shot. But by Saturday, the discussion was no longer on expediting the delivery of the drug, but whether its use would save or kill Rudy. Desperate for any solution, George explored every option to ferry the drug from Detroit to New York as fast as possible. With Rudy's condition deteriorating rapidly, the only feasible solution George could think of was to send an airplane to Detroit. But even this drastic and expensive measure guaranteed nothing. The possibility of performing blood transfusions on Rudy seemed to be a more practical solution. A donor with Rudy's blood type was located, and the volunteer was stationed on the hospital's 8th floor. The blood transfusions were postponed and then canceled, as the medical consensus was unanimous that Rudy would not survive the procedure. At George's request, Dr. Rawls and Dr. Meeker canceled all of their private practice appointments in order to remain at Rudy's bedside and issue hourly bulletins to the press. By Saturday evening, the possible arrival of any Metafen looked bleak, and the mood on the 8th floor of the Polyclinic Hospital took on an air of defeat. It was on that Saturday evening George had a disturbing run-in with Dr. Paul Durham. As he entered what he presumed to be a vacant hospital room next to Rudy's, in the hopes of resting for a while, he heard Dr. Durham calling out to him. George discovered the physician prone on a hospital bed, holding a stethoscope on his own chest. "Ullman," Durham ordered, "get in here and let me check your heart. It's in bad shape." With Rudy clinging to life a few doors down, George made his disgust with Durham's antics known. He stormed out, throwing his hands in the air, saying, "I think you're crazy." It was also on Saturday that a Catholic priest talked his way past the 8th floor security guards to approach George, saying he wished to hear Rudy's confession. Fearing that the sight of a priest standing at his bedside might frighten Rudy, George refused the priest's request. Before leaving, the priest admonished George, saying, "If he should die without the last rites, it will be on your head, George Ullman." Late that afternoon, George lifted his ban on admittance to Rudy's room by allowing 2 visitors to come to his bedside. Joe Schenck arrived to speak with the fallen star of his new blockbuster movie, and on his way out of the hospital he paused to speak with the reporters. He told them Rudy said he planned to fool his doctors and get well. And after George telephoned Jean Acker, she arrived to spend a few moments with Rudy before rushing out of the room in tears. By Sunday, George thought better of his refusal to grant the priest's request to hear Rudy's confession, and he placed a call to St. Malachi's Church on 47th Street. He later felt he'd made the right decision in summoning the priest, as Rudy rested more peacefully after the visit. Sometime after the priest left, the nurse administered Rudy's scheduled injection of morphine. As soon as he fell asleep, George hurried back to the ambassador for a quick shower and a shave. Knowing the medication was having less effect on Rudy with each dose, within the hour George was trudging down the hospital's 8th floor corridor. After a glance at the medical chart hanging on the end of Rudy's bed, he turned to the nurse on duty and told her to call his wife at the Ambassador Hotel, as well as Frank Mennillo, and request that they both come to the hospital at once. That Sunday evening, Frank's son Arnold was already on the Jersey Shore, where he planned to meet his father the following morning. But when Frank took the call from the hospital nurse, he didn't pause to phone his son with his change of plans. He grabbed his hat, and within a half an hour he was standing in Rudy's hospital room. George and Frank would share the vigil at Rudy's bedside that long Sunday night, pacing the room as his fever remained consistently above 104, and as nurses fought to bring it under control with alcohol sponge baths. The acrid alcohol vapors made it nearly impossible to breathe in the stifling room, and George and Frank could do little for Rudy. Other than to adjust the electric fans, they could only sit for hours on the chairs next to the bed and be there whenever he opened his eyes. Throughout the night, Rudy faded in and out of consciousness, and George and Frank watched him struggle to comprehend his dismal situation with his waning sensibilities. It seemed to them that he wasn't sure if minutes, hours, or days were passing by, and whether he was even awake or dreaming. The activity in his hospital room competed for his dwindling attention with the confusing dreams of his morphine haze. In one moment he could hear George speaking with someone by the door, and in another he watched Frank dozing in the chair next to his bed. In the next moment, Rudy was again sinking into another treacherous dream, a dream in which he was a little boy peering over a windowsill of his childhood home, a dream in which he could clearly see the long view of the Ionian Sea. In this particular dream, he stood before the familiar window, clutching his father's steel razor in his little hand. With his other hand, he fingered a deep, bloody gash across his cheek. At this distant memory of his first tragic shave, Rudy struggled for just one more deep breath to regain consciousness. With leaden steps, he was running from his nightmare's landscape, through an olive orchard, thick with brambles, and into a dense forest. It was dawn on Monday morning when he opened his eyes. George was stroking his head. Hoping Rudy might return to a more restful sleep, George turned to lower the blinds on the window. Rudy raised his hand from the bed, saying, "Leave the blinds, George. I feel fine. I want the light to greet me." George hesitated, knowing the sunlight would soon streak across Rudy's bed. In a voice stronger than George had heard in days, Rudy asked, "Wasn't it an awful thing that we were lost in the woods last night?" George was too shocked to reply, and returned to stroking Rudy's head. "On the one hand, George," Rudy went on, "you don't appreciate the humor of that, do you?" George tried to smile. "Sure I do, Rudy, sure I do." With a distant look in his eyes, Rudy added, "On the other hand, you don't seem to appreciate the seriousness of it either." Monday morning, August 23rd, promised to be another scorcher, and George and Frank had been awake all night rotating their watch at Rudy's bedside. From their vantage point high on the hospital's 8th floor, they could see the encampments of Rudy's faithful milling on the street below, with their flickering candles and bouquets of flowers already fading in the morning heat. While vendors hawked their hot dogs and shaved ice to Rudy's crowd, horns honked, cars slammed on their brakes, and those New Yorkers not praying upwards in the direction of Rudolph Valentino's hospital window headed off into their work week. As George and Frank hovered and made small efforts to assist in the business of Rudy's terrible morning, down on the Jersey Shore, Arnold Mennillo wondered what had happened to his father. While his phone calls to his father's apartment rang unanswered, Frank and George were leaning in over Rudy. Sometime around 8 o'clock, he opened his eyes for a brief moment and uttered only one word, which he spoke in Italian, "Madre." After this faint declaration, he closed his eyes. George and Frank stood by in silence, hoping he would awaken and say more, but Rudy did not regain another flicker of consciousness. After an hour passed, Frank left the room to phone Father Joseph Congedo from St. Malachi's to request that last rites be given to Rudy. Within a half an hour, Father Joseph and a second priest made their entrance into Rudy's hospital room. Processing in a robe and white stole, Father Joseph sprinkled holy water on Rudy and blessed the room. Frank explained to George that if he planned to remain in the room for the rite of extreme unction, he would be required to do so on his knees. After the nurse spread a clean sheet over Rudy, she reluctantly left her patient's side. With his face drawn from the fight, Rudy was comatose, sweating profusely, his lungs rapidly filling with fluid and his heart faltering. Father Joseph then conducted a brief absolution of Frank and George's sins as they knelt before him. Meanwhile, a second priest spread a white linen cloth on a small table by the bed and arranged an altar of 2 candles, a crucifix, a pyx containing communion wafers, and a vessel of consecrated oil. Father Joseph assessed Rudy's unconscious state and whispered to his assistant that the rite of communion would be omitted from the sacrament, as Rudy was unable to swallow. The 2 priests' methodical movements irritated George, and he shifted from knee to knee. After all, Frank was the devout Catholic, and he had insisted on these last rites. For George, it seemed that everything should be done as quickly as possible at that point. He felt physically sick with panic at the horrifying development. For the first time in a week, no one was medically attending to Rudy. While the assisting priest lit the 2 candles and arranged the crucifix on the table, Father Joseph removed his white stole and replaced it with a violet one. He then processed once more around Rudy's bed to bless the room, and in a monotone chant he delivered his first prayer. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, may any power that the devil has over you be utterly destroyed as I place my hands on you and call upon the help of the glorious and holy Mother of God, the Virgin Mary. Amen. With Rudy's fever gaining strength by the minute, his hollow breathing grew louder and rattled Frank and George's nerves. Father Joseph calmly went about the business of the last rites by placing his thumb into the container of the consecrated oil. He then leaned over Rudy to anoint each of his eyes, saying, "May the Lord forgive you by this holy anointing, and his most loving mercy whatever sins you have committed by use of your sight. Amen." This prayer was repeated again and again as Father Joseph anointed Rudy's forehead, his ears, his nostrils, his lips, the palms of his hand, and his feet. "May the Lord forgive you by this holy anointing, and his most loving mercy, whatever sins you have committed. May the Lord forgive you by this holy anointing, and his most loving mercy, whatever sins you have committed." When Father Joseph folded the sheet to anoint Rudy's feet and hands, George eyed the open blinds. The sun was streaking across the bed, and he could not shake his feeling of dread that this might be increasing Rudy's fever. George's anxiety mounted during the 20 minutes it took to administer the sacrament. As soon as Father Joseph delivered his final prayer and left the room, George was off his knees and closing those blinds. Rudy's nurse had already rushed into the room to resume her bedside tending. Frank did not return to his usual post on the chair, but instead sat next to Rudy on the bed. When the nurse informed him this was strictly against hospital policy, he waved her off duty. Sliding one arm under Rudy's shoulders, Frank lifted him up from the pillow and held him close to his chest. With the blinds clicked shut and Rudy at last safe from the morning sun, George was overcome with emotion. Leaning his weight against the wall, he finally broke down and cried. As the 2 men waited on, they were unaware Rudy was already walking in Blackfeather's shadow. In the moon of the black cherries and to the solemn beat of a skin drum, the ancient American Indian had just spirited Rudy away, far from the pain of the hospital room, far from the echo of his death rattle, and far from his losing battle with that fever. While Frank held him in his arms, and while George wept, Rudy and Blackfeather were breaking through the clouds and heading towards the sacred mountain. George stood outside the Polyclinic Hospital's press room and paused for a moment under the stairwell to catch his breath. He stared in at the reporters slouching on their metal folding chairs, their hats plopped down over their faces as they lounged in the noon heat, awaiting his next bulletin. It was slowly dawning on him that he'd been so focused upon Rudy throughout the past week, he had not allowed himself a single thought of life without him. Disoriented at that looming prospect, he swore silently to himself that he would just do whatever was required of him for Rudy. He stood there gathering his thoughts. What would he say to the press, and how would he say it? With a deliberate breath of thick hospital air, he stepped forward into the press room. At George's sudden arrival, the reporters shuffled to attention. Their chairs clunked down against the floor. While they opened their notebooks to record Rudy's latest vitals, George raised his arm straight out to his sides and gave it to them. "He's dead." George stood there motionless and offered no further explanation as the press room ruptured upon the impact of his two words. The metal folding chairs flew as reporters fell upon the door in a race for the nearest telephone. Before George turned to leave, he could already hear a newspaper boy in the street wailing the unbelievable, "Valentino's dead! Valentino's dead!" On the march back to the familiar path from the press room up to Rudy's room, George could hear shrieking out in the street and women along the hallway bursting into tears. Passing the hospital switchboard, he heard the operators frantically answering one call after another. "Yes, he died, yes, he's dead." George knew the news was hitting hard, and this had him picking up his pace. As he walked for the last time down the 8th floor corridor, he caught a glance at his pocket watch and made the quick calculation. It was almost 9:30 in the morning in Los Angeles. "Damn," he mumbled. "I've got to call Lou." Thanks for listening, and my next installment will be the epilogue and whatever happened to. I hope you will subscribe to this podcast so you will be notified when the next installment goes online. As always, you may find a copy of AffairsValentino on Amazon and all online book-selling venues.